No longer does one's language get in the way of communicating with people who speak a different language. Technology has given us the ability to immediately translate, and that's a wonderful thing. It helps us talk to each other that we never could have done before. But language does not necessarily build community. And I think that the two ingredients that are necessary for building community go beyond language are a shared vision and a mutual respect. Here's my story. In 1957, I was ordained a minister in the Methodist Church and received at annual conference an appointment to be the minister in charge of a circuit of 6 rural churches in the middle part of Black Belt, Alabama. I got a lot of suggestions and advice that night, the night of my ordination, most of which I ignored, some of which I have forgotten, but there's one that I will always remember and take to heart. Brother Pickard, retired Methodist pastor, came up to me when we were alone and said, "Max, just remember that people in your congregation will not care how much you know until they know how much you care." I thought that was good advice, but I didn't know at the time how it would be tested so quickly. While I was still unpacking books in the parsonage, a man knocked at the door, identified himself as one of the members of one of my churches. I discovered later he never came to church. Said he just dropped by to welcome me to the community. Well, I appreciated that. And we sat in the living room and had coffee. Had the beginning of a nice visit. It didn't take me long to realize he had another message to deliver, because after the polite, the courteous things, he said, "You know, we've got a nice community here. People tend to get along, respect for the churches and all of that." Then he said, there was one thing, there was a rumor for a while that the Klan had planned to burn a cross in front of the parsonage because the previous pastor was so liberal. Now, I knew where I was. I grew up in Black Belt, Alabama. I knew what the system of segregation, and I knew the civil rights struggle was beginning in a way it had never done before. And I knew that the membership in the Ku Klux Klan in the county in which we sat was as high or higher per capita than any other county in Alabama. And I also realized that he was giving me a warning. And I said, "Well, that really bothers me." And he nodded his head, and I said, "One of the reasons it bothers me is because I keep a loaded shotgun in by the door. And I can just imagine waking up middle of the night with a mob in front of the house and firing into that mob and wounding, maybe killing somebody. I don't know whether I could live with that." And he acknowledged that that would indeed be a bad thing. We visited a while longer, and he left. And after he'd gone, my wife said, "Why did you tell him about about the gun? You don't even own a gun." And I said, "Yeah, you know that, and I know that, but he doesn't know that." A couple of days later, I was down at the post office, and a member of my church said, "Max, I understand you had a visit from the Klan the other night." I thought so. There are no secrets in a small town. Within the first week I was there, the chairman of the official board of one of the churches called a meeting of the congregation. And the agenda was one item only. The Methodist Church at the national level had a segregated system at that time, and there was a proposal to abolish segregation at the annual conference level by simply erasing the racial boundary. Very simple proposal, and that was presented to all the churches throughout the country. Well, when Harmon presented that proposal to the church tonight, there was an immediate emotional and clearly overwhelming negative vote to that. I have to say that these people were considered to be good people, but they were children of the South, and they were defending the segregated system at all cost. Mine was the only voice that was in support of the proposal, and when I spoke, the reaction to me and to what I said was emotional, it was intense, and it was almost violent. One of the members called me a communist. And I said, let's not get into this, because you call me a communist, we'll have to go to court. I don't think either one of us wants that. And another member was hyperventilating so much that as soon as the meeting was over, he raced out of the church. The church didn't have the one central aisle, it had two side aisles. He started down one of the aisles. I literally ran so that I could meet him as he came out the other, and I met him as he came out the door. And Mr. Harmon, the bishop says, I'm going to be here for a year as your pastor. Do you want to shake hands, or do you want to fight? And he stewed a while, and face was still red. Finally, he said, hell, I can't fight the preacher. And I said, don't let that stop you. I put out my hand. He put out his, and we shook hands. Now, I'd like to say that after a while, he came around and we became real good friends and all of that, but that's not what happened. We did have what I think was a healthy respect for each other, so much so that in other issues that the church dealt with, he was one of my greatest allies. But I did not change his attitude about race. I stayed there for 3 years. I thought at the moment when I was facing him that day that mine might be the shortest pastorate that church had ever known. But I stayed there 3 years, left on my own accord, and during that time I baptized babies, visited the sick, grieved with the people who had lost loved ones, conducted their funerals, counseled and married the young. And through it all, preached unequivocally of a God of inclusive love that translated all boundaries, including race. The people were friendly. My wife and I and our children visited in their homes, had meals with them. It was a good 3 years for the most part. But the conflict was always there. I'd like to believe that while I did not cause any great transformation of the people, that we maintained that respect. There used to be a sign, stop sign, as you're leaving Highway 24 and intersecting with Highway 81 in northern Kansas. And beneath the stop sign, there is another sign that said, "Look again." And beneath that sign, there's one that said, "Look again." I think that's what's necessary in order for us to develop any sense of community and respect for one another. If we have a shared vision of peace and justice, we need to look deeply into one another's eyes, see the goodness that's there, and build the trust that's necessary to build and maintain the community. Now, I'm not so naive as to believe that the time will come or all we have to do is to hold hands around a circle and sing Kumbaya. That's not going to happen. And we have to resist the evil, the mean spirit that is prevalent today. We have to develop clever strategies, consistent, and stay with it. Or else we're never going to have the kind of community that most of us really want. I take a cue from the author of Proverbs, somewhere in the 29th chapter, I believe it is. He says, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." I would say that where there is no vision, the people perish. Justice is denied, and compassion has its hands tied. There's no report card on my pastorate in Alabama in 1957 to 1960. That's not my point. My point is that my story took place in the crucible of disturbing times, but I tell it to you in the midst of equally challenging times. And the lessons learned from that experience, I think, are just as applicable as today as they were then. And I leave you with what Brother Pickard said to me that night that I was ordained. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. It doesn't answer the problems. It doesn't solve all the conflict. But it's the beginning. And that's what we need to focus on. Thank you for listening.